I would like to thank everyone for joining us in this global webinar related to the 2020 ACFE report to the nation. Today, we have a very special guest speaker, Mr. Dorris, the President and CEO of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. And when I was preparing this webinar with him, he told me that this is the first appearance that he's gonna have to speak about the new report to the nation that just published this month. It was just published around 2 or 3 weeks ago. And this is why this is a really premium event where you are gonna get exposed to the first findings, the results of this great report. Usually every 2 years, ACFE, they prepare this report to the nation where they will showcase all the fraud cases happening globally. And this webinar was possible with a sponsor from all the association in the Middle East. So I would like to thank all the board members, all the associations of the ACFE chapters in the Middle East for supporting us and making this possible. And I would like to thank you all for taking your time to attend this session. So before we start the session, let's see exactly what are the key findings in the report. What actually we have discovered over the last 2 years. Over the last 2 years, the cases that reported to ACFE, more than 2,500 fraud cases. So we can see fraud is a booming industry. Everything is recession, economy on recession, but fraud is booming, which is good news for fraud fighters because you are gonna have more positions in the future. And we can see the amount of fraud is also increasing, not only the cases. 3.6 billion fraud cases happen, and now we are speaking only about the cases that were reported. We're not speaking about all the cases. We are speaking about the cases that were reported. We believe there are much more cases that they actually happen and we didn't discover them and they were not reported. Now, the interesting thing here in the key findings that usually typical fraud case will take 14 months before we discover it. So you can imagine the damage, how much fraud will be happening and how much losses the organization will suffer. And at the end, can they recover this money or not? But what organization they need to focus on when they are thinking about implementing a compliance program is how much is the loss related to fraud. They say the cost of fraud inside organizations are around 5% of their revenue annually. This is why we really need to think about implementing a compliance program properly to ensure that we actually reduce this amount of losses. And Mr. Bruce is going to share with you so many key findings and details and research that this report came up with. And with that, I will give the mic to Mr. Bruce. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Iyad. And first of all, thank you to all the chapters, Iyad, and everyone involved with the chapters. I know that so many in the Middle East are part of the supporting this program. And it's fantastic that you all could come together to hear this and to discuss. I was talking with Iyad just a few minutes before, and the report to the nations is something that was really born out of what he just said and what we talk about when we're at live events. Is back in the early 1990s, we started getting phone calls here because the association, as many of you know, started in 1988. It's been around over 30 years. But Dr. Wells started getting phone calls from media, from others who are wanting to know, well, what type of fraud is out there and how much is it costing us? And so, this kept coming up and coming up and coming up. And so the idea was born, why don't we ask you? Because we are sitting on the largest body of knowledge for anti-fraud behavior, or for fraudulent behaviors and anti-fraud controls, and those who are intimately familiar with what's going on and related with fraud within their industry, their business, their government, and the like. And so out of that, you started to get a lot of CFEs writing in saying, hey, this is what, based off the questions that we sent out. And I believe the first survey was around 6 pages, and it was handwritten. My very good friend, John Warren, who's Vice President and General Counsel for the ACFE, he's been at the association nearly 25 years. And he was actually one of his first assignment, because this was again 1996, and 24 years now that the report has come out. And one of his first assignments was to develop the report to the nation. And so he was going through and looking at these questions, sending these surveys out, and spreading them across the table. If you could imagine going back into the mid-1990s and putting together all of this with paper, and the joke was always, where are the note cards? Because they were putting out and comparing everything by note cards and looking at the statistics. And so because of that, and because we had that body of knowledge, we were able to put that out. And there was so much fanfare in 1996 when this was released, so that every couple of years, we started asking questions and getting feedback from members, feedback from the media, and it grew and grew and grew into what it is now. It started out initially just within the United States, but well over 10 years ago. Started reaching out and getting more information as the ACFE grew, as there's so much within so many regions of the world. And then just a few years later, we started coming up with having those regional reports. Had the global fraud study, of course, with all the information, but then breaking it down for the Middle East and North Africa, for Western Europe, for parts of Asia, depending on those regions and how geographically clustered they were, so that not only you get to see it on the worldwide, but let's look and see, is bribery and corruption more so a problem here than it is, and we need to make sure we have more controls in place than we would say for some asset misappropriation. And so what we've been able to do is to accumulate that data. But let me just tell you that it would not be possible without certified fraud examiners taking the time to give input. I mean, you are talking about 77 questions that you take the time to fill out very responsibly, and making sure that we get the data that we need in order to produce this study. As Ian was mentioning, this is something, and feel free to jump in if you wish, but this is something that we put this information out there, but it's also very, very helpful for you to tell, as he was mentioning with, I wrote this down, and companies want to know. They want to know what their investment is. And we get to see that in some of the data that's in here. Because, well, how do I know that what you're doing, fraud examiner, is really benefiting the company? And so what you're able to do is say, here it is. And here it is going back to 1996 of how important these controls are, and why we need to make sure that we are continuing to invest in the control environment of our organization, in particular, as it relates to anti-fraud measures. And so because of that, the report to the nations could not be put together without, as Ian was mentioning, well over 2,500 cases that were used, that were, ACFE took the time to put that information in. So we're very, very excited to be able to produce this. As Ian had mentioned, this is it's the first time I've spoken on it. Part of the reason is, as we're online now, and so many chapters in the Middle East are having to put everything online due to COVID-19 and the restrictions of having live live events and everything going to webinars. So thank goodness we have the technology in place to where we can talk about this and where we can have these types of interactions. So I'm really, really, really excited. And I want, Ian, as we go to that first slide there, I also want to thank, again, I mentioned John Warren, Vice President, General Counsel, also Andy McNeil, who is our Director of Research at the ACFE. As I was mentioning, when these calls started coming in the 1990s, it was never the intent of the ACFE to be this research function, but it started coming together because, you know, we had the training, we want to provide that education, but because of what you need as CFEs and what people were asking about, especially those not related to the fraud field, and what we could provide, it became what it is. So you see one of those first slides there, how occupational fraud is committed. Ed talked about that in some of the infographics that you see there at the previous slide that he had put up there. So if you have not had the opportunity to download this, if you're a member of the ACFE, we encourage you to go in, and there's a lot more once you go into diving into the ACFE.com and all the reports there. There are things going back for into 2019, still relevant now. But when you see what we talk about here, we've got asset misappropriation, corruption, financial statement fraud. When we look at the fraud tree, we spend a lot of controls on asset misappropriation, a lot of money on the controls with asset misappropriation. We do with corruption, we do with financial statement fraud. But you can see how we break it down in terms of, well, even though, you know, the cases that are reported, you know, over 85% related to asset misappropriation, you know, the amount of loss, median loss, is around $100,000 US. Whereas you see what we still, even though we have to focus on there with, you know, control measures, we still have to make sure that we focus on controls with financial statement fraud and corruption as well, because you see that amount increase even though the percentage of cases is small. Why is that? Well, because, you know, those who have the ability to manipulate and to really do harm to an organization through financial statement fraud are much, much fewer. Whereas when you're looking at asset misappropriation, at least you know, in the grand scheme, you've got, you know, people who have maybe only been around a few years with an organization, and we start looking at that data as we go through the report. So it's really encourage you as we move to the next slide to go to acfe.com/RTTN. So when you look at the very first slide that Iad had up there, and it had for open thinking, it had /RTTN. Same thing, acfe.com/RTTN. You can go in and download this if you're not a member of the ACFE. We really encourage you to look at this. And the great thing about this, the report within, and there's so much information on there, and you can tell I'm really excited about this. As Iad was mentioning, this is the first time that I've spoken on this with COVID-19 really impacting a lot of events that we had. I'm like a volcano. I'm just ready to erupt and talk about the report and all of the anti-fraud measures that you have at your disposal. And right now, you are going to be hit by your board of directors, by your senior management, and saying, hey, look, our business is down. Our grants aren't coming in, whatever industry you are in. And you're going to be hit with questions of, well, why do we need this? We need to cut 10%. We need to cut 20%. Well, you've gotten the data now. This could not come out at a more perfect time for you, because now you have infographics that you can take to your management to show them how important it is to have anti-fraud controls in place, because you can demonstrate to them, if we don't have these in place, here is what we are losing. And this is not something that we just came out with and pulled out of a hat. You know, you're talking about 25 years of data that, I mean, and that's a tremendous sample size. For those of you who are statisticians, when we start looking at how this has gone over the years, and sometimes, you know, some of these questions and areas deviate, you know, a few points here and there, but by and large, it's fairly consistent with when you have controls in place, what they do for an organization in order to save it costs. It's almost like it pays for itself in essence. We want to make sure that we're looking at that, because if you can see on that slide, that figure 6 that Ian has put up there, for a lot of the cases in median loss, that time frame is relatively short. But the longer that those hang out there, the larger that loss is going to be. So, and you see that within the graph. So when it begins to be detected, you saw that 14-month in there. The takeaway from this particular slide, quick detection is imperative in order to stop fraud loss. So the faster that you're able to detect it, that number that is that you see to the far right of the screen, much better. So that's what we're looking for. That's why we want to make sure that we focus on that. So if you will you, let's go to the next slide.
Okay, what you are saying here is interesting when you are saying usually, between 19 and 24 months, we discover fraud is happening. Why? Because individuals, they get greedy. So when they are stealing a little bit, we don't see it because they are not hitting our red flags. But after some time, they feel comfortable, they are stealing more. And at that time, when they are stealing really massive amount of money, we discover them. So we need to have the proper controls in place to ensure that we discover them in less than 6 months when they are about to do the big fraud, not later after. I agree with you completely. Absolutely.
Yeah, the more we have in place, the quicker they are. When you're looking at what that median is, and keep in mind that median of that 14 months is a lot of times has to deal with when you're talking about 2,500 cases. So we try to take out those anomalies in order to come in with that. But it still goes, when you start looking at the data, it is the quicker you're able to take care of that problem and discover it, the less loss that you're going to have. So that's, so if you look at the next slide that we have up here, how long do different occupational fraud schemes last? And I wanted to put this up here just so you can, this is more for you to think about in terms of what your job function is. So obviously, if you're more on the accounting function, the payroll side, things like that, you're wanting to make sure that you've got adequate controls in place because of how long that it takes, and to make sure that we're actually going in, we've got good segregation of duties. And when you start thinking of how perpetrators go in and conceal these things, we have to make sure that we as fraud examiners or within our organization have the right controls in place to eradicate that and to start to reduce what that month span is. So again, as we move to the next slide, we want to think about our particular areas as we start looking at how we are dealing with fraud within not just our organization, but how it affects you if you are relatively large group and organization to where you have to focus on that one. So if you will, as we look at this next one, this is one of the ones that is really, really consistent over the years. How was occupational fraud initially detected? And as we all know, it is by tip. In fact, if you look at that number at 43%, that's 3 times larger than any of the other ones there. Now, don't get me wrong, internal audit, management route, all these others are very, very important functions within the control environment of your organization. But when you look at the 2,500 plus cases, these reports are coming through tip. Now, I realize that a lot of time you have these hotlines in place as we move over to the next slide there. When we're dealing with hotlines, most of them are coming from employees, as they should be. So what do we take away from this? Well, if you think about it, and be interesting to be able to get feedback on, how many of those of you who are in the fraud examination field, and yeah, feel free to jump in on this, if of the tips that are coming in, how many of them are not necessarily lead to you investigating a fraud and discovering a fraud, but how much are they really relate to fraud, and how much them should be given to a human resources department? Is someone upset because they took their soda or their yogurt from the refrigerator in the break room and they want to report it that way? So how many of those cases are actually legitimate complaints? But when we're able to break those down with the 2,500 actual fraud cases, when we started looking at those, nearly 50% of those cases coming through tip being discovered, and then looking at those tips and where they're coming from, most of those, as it should be, are coming from the employees. We look at a few of the other areas in terms of customers, vendors, those outside of our cylinder. And so this is a good takeaway for this, is you want to be able to think and educate outside of your organization. So many of you do a wonderful job of educating and making sure that you've got good, robust controls within your organization. And so that that first line of defense on up, you've got people who are aware of what fraud. But even thinking about outside, so if you're able to provide notice, if whatever that document or invoice is going out, you say, by the way, if you have an issue, feel free to call this, or if you something that you are uncomfortable with, having the ability to tell them about what that hotline is and where they can give that information. So it's really just a matter of thinking beyond just our employees. Obviously, the employees are incredibly important, but you can see that others are willing to be a part of this. Most people want to do the right thing. The thing is, we have to make it available for them. And if you can see with the data over the years, a lot of times people are really robust about, hey, like, I got to tell you about this. And they even find ways around it only because they want to do the right thing. And maybe it wasn't publicized the way it needs to. And we are increasingly doing better at publicizing within our organization. Fantastic work there. But even in some organizations where it's not there, they're finding ways around it in order to report that. When you look at that employee data, and I don't have a slide on this, let's stay here for a moment. When you start looking at that, I tell you, I'm excited about this. Can you tell? I mean, this is fantastic stuff. And so when you look at what the employees and who they're going to, I mean, they're going outside, they're going to their directors. They're going to the board. I mean, we'll go in and we'll tell someone about it, even if we don't have that ability. And so when you look at the way, most of them are coming in via telephone. I think there's a slide on this a little bit later, or electronic communications via email. And we're starting to see where that is really, really important to have multiple chains. Or multiple ways for an organization to take these tips. Incredibly important to have those. And I know most of you are going to have that, especially if you're in an environment that requires this, you're going to have those in place. But if you don't, look at the multiple platforms that are out there. If you look at all the control measures, it's really one of the most cost effective is to be able to give that conduit to your staff, to those outside your organization that are familiar with what's going on, and letting them contact you, your internal audit department, your fraud examination team, whoever it is that it's reported to, so that we can get that information to the right people. So let's look at
I completely agree with you. There is a very interesting research done by Harvard Business Review, and the research said that senior management, they really looked at the research by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and who the senior management, they are doing fraud. They actually download your reports because they want to know exactly what are actually your findings for them to be able to understand how they can commit the fraud. And when they noticed that around more than 50% of the tips are coming from employees, they decided to implement countermeasures. So the research from Harvard Business School said the following: senior management, because they know that more than 50% of the tips are coming from employees, decided to give stock options to employees when they are committing fraud. So by doing this, now employees, they have stock options, and they are saying after 1 year, 2 years, if the stock price will go up, we will make compensation. But after that, they see senior management doing fraud. And now they are thinking, should we go to the hotline and report this fraud? And in case we report it, everyone will know there is a fraud happening, so the stock price will go down and we lose our compensation? Or why do we care? If they are doing fraud, it's good for everyone. The price is going to go up, we will get compensation. So in indirect way, senior management, they found a way to bribe the employees to keep them quiet. So in that way, they will be able to commit their fraud. There's a very interesting research. And this research done over so many years, where Harvard Business Review, they reported that organizations that they had fraud, they were giving stock options to their employees.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's what's interesting, if we move on to the next slide, it kind of elaborates on that in that, you know, a lot of times you're going to have an organization that goes beyond it. Really, perhaps in that case, this is going to fall on deaf ears, and no one's going to pay attention to it. Which is why, you know, there are things within, you know, depending on the country and depending on the structure, for them to go outside of that. So it's a very interesting study that you mentioned. When we look at this next slide here in Figure 11, how does the fraud detection method relate to that loss? And so if you look at those first two up there, and you've got the colors, you know, the blue bars at the bottom and the ones that are sort of orange or red there at the top, you know, passive versus, you know, the ones that are proactive. And so, yeah, I think that everyone in this community would say that we need to be more proactive about it. I mean, being able to have a good proactive anti-fraud culture within our organization from the top down. I mean, again, it is told at the top. This all starts with that good management support. You know, so if we have those proactive measures, you can see that median loss and the dollar amount associated with it, and then the months of which that duration is much, much less. So when we're talking about passive, you know, we're finding somewhat by accident, or law enforcement comes in. Not a very effective way. I think we can agree that that's how that we should find out, is having some law enforcement agency within your jurisdiction coming and telling you about fraud that is happening within your organization. So when you look at that, those passive versus those who are more active, you know, when fraud is detected proactively, it's detected much faster. And as we saw at the one of the very first slides, it lowers that loss. So that's what we're wanting to do, is to put those controls in place. And as he had mentioned, you know, giving this report, and I know that many of you are downloading this, focus on some of the infographics, because some of you might have a board that is not, they only want to see just a few things. They love the fact of what you're doing, but to spend time culling through all the data and you know, an 80-page report, maybe a little time consuming, they don't have it. Go in and look at the infographics. A couple of those I put at the very beginning of this. There are more in there, so that you can give that to management, those who aren't as familiar with it, so they can see it almost like an executive summary. And they're able to use that to further perhaps either increase or to keep the same budget of what you're having, especially as it relates to COVID-19, as we begin moving into the recovery phase of that. So if you will, yeah, can we move to the next slide there? And I was mentioning to this, and I alluded about how we're noticing just the technology trends, how we are used to meet in person, and we will again someday. But and how we would have a telephone conference and all. Well, now things are moving. We're online. We're able to broadcast to what you got about 1,000 people right now able to hear this online from a computer here in the middle of Texas, all the way around the world to the Middle East. So we make those available for our employees as well. So you see the employee hotline over the years and how that's shrank. Doesn't mean that it's not effective. It's just we're providing some web-based or some electronic form for people to use that. Now they're almost the same. So we want to make sure that we've got mechanisms in place and that we protect them, because some are maybe a little bit distrusting of it. So we want to make sure that we've got, for paper-based, for telephone, and for electronic communications as well. The more that we have out there, it's a sign of the time, but the more we have out there, the better it is to collect this information. If we can move to the next slide there.
I just here, it's interesting to see the main issue with actually implementing a formal reporting mechanisms, that whistleblowers, they are afraid from retaliation. They are afraid that someone is going to come after them. And without having the proper protection for the whistleblowers, or without having the right incentives, like in US, if you come and blow the whistle, you are going to get a reward. And at the same time, government, they have some kind of policy and protections for them. The good news that today in the UAE, there is discussion that soon we are going to have whistleblowing protection regulations. So in that way, you can come to the government and report any fraud happening, and you will know that the government will protect you from any retaliation.
I mean, having that government backing is important. When you start looking at, the Fraud Magazine just came in, everyone should be reading it, and with the Danske Bank whistleblower, and and how laws have changed and what the protection is. So that's important to not only have it with corporate within our organizations, but making sure our governments are there and there's legislations in order to protect as well. So as we look at, well, let's talk about our victims organization. Let's shift a little bit here. And so how do fraud schemes vary by organization? As we would expect, corruption. We're looking at conflicts of interest, bribery, things like that. Obviously, it's fairly high, but when we look at the deviations between small and larger organizations, you see the green, less than 100 employees, the blue, greater than 100. So it gives you an idea of what you're facing. And if you want to really go into data even further, again, we only have a certain amount of time here. I could talk about this stuff all day long, but there is so much information packed in there. And if you want to go further, as we move to the next slide, if you go to acfe.com/RTTN, but there are other reports that we have on there. One is /team report, acfe./team report, and then /tech report as well. It relates to just in 2019, so it's very, very fresh information relating to anti-fraud technology and the investigations in-house. So it's even more data, and that's what we want to do to provide to you. That information is there. Please, please go and download it. Use it to help, especially now as we start dealing with the issues related to COVID-19. One of the most important slides is this one that I just put up there. It says figure 21 on it. What anti-fraud controls are the most common? This is one that's used quite often and is really, really something that's cited by media and others is what external audit of financial statements. And for those in the fraud examination field who've been doing this a while, realize that may be the most one that's in place, but it's not the main design of a external audit is not to look for fraud. I mean, that's a component of it, certainly, and a very important one. But I can remember in it was a mid to late 1990s, in the United States, and then adopted by auditing standards outside the U.S. as well, is when fraud was very first issued. I mean, we had statements on auditing standards that started using that word. And I mean, before it was errors and irregularities. And so we've seen that transition to where, that's a very effective, or rather one of the most used controls in there. But when you start looking at this slide and then looking at some of the other, especially on the next slide as we move to it, and we'll look at it a little bit further in connection with that next slide there. What is the presence of those 17 or 18 anti-fraud controls in place? So this just tells you, your takeaway is, if you had a control in place, it worked. So as we look up here, I mean, if you had a code of conduct versus not having a code of, your loss doubled. You had an internal audit department, with or without, your loss doubled. And when you look at that, I mean, that's straight across. This is coming from CFE showing that reduction if we had these in place. Some of these incredibly cost effective, a hotline, a code of conduct, for goodness sake. When you start management review, really diving into it, which that management review goes to that code of conduct, and also looking at the anti-fraud policies. I mean, these come together. And so if we've got the good anti-fraud, that risk management within that organization, and it's adopted from the top, it trickles down, we are going to see these really, really help an organization. And some of them, as I mentioned, and use this as your, as you go through budget cycles, especially in the next few months and year for that matter, showing just how important it is to have these in place and what it does to an organization and truly helps it. So if we move into the next one there.
I agree with you. The interesting thing that here we can see in the research that the most powerful internal control inside the organization is actually code of conduct. And what we call it the culture of the organization. They say culture is really your first line of defense, because culture can eat strategy for breakfast. So whatever controls you have in place, if you don't have the proper culture in place, they are not going to work. There can be collusion, there can be overriding of control, there can be so many issues that will make the internal control fail. So this is why, definitely code of conduct is the first line, and then internal auditors, they are going to come to check to ensure everything is in place.
Absolutely. And then you can see some further data in the terms of the time period and how it relates to the loss. And the thing is, as we've talked about, the longer it goes on, the more that amount is going to be. Remember, these are median numbers from over 2,500 cases. So think, and that's the reason very early in this webinar, we talked about take this back to it and let it resonate with your department and what you're doing in your organization and how you can use this to be more effective. But using this in order to explain to management why you need to keep your department, why you need to keep your controls in place, and continuing that education and to learn about it. So again, more information, really dig into the report. Let's go to the next slide, unless you want to add anything to that. Really goes into how the anti-fraud controls vary by the size of an organization. The external audit, again, depending on the size of the organization, of 100 plus employees, whether they're publicly traded or required for other reasons within a jurisdiction, perhaps a loan covenant, things like that, you're going to have those in place. But small businesses have to make sure that they've got good anti-fraud controls in place. Some of them may not be as important as others, depending on the size, but we want to make sure that we've got at least the ones that are cost effective and the ones that can really cut that in half when you start looking at the data. So let's move over to the next slide and start dealing with our perpetrators. As you see up here, what's a background check on a perpetrator? And I wanted to highlight this. And there's this is going to be relevant to whatever jurisdiction you're in, whether or not there is good data. But when you're talking about a criminal history, most are not going to have one. So we really have to dive into some of the other things that we can legally, again, within that organization. But what I'd like to take away as we move into the next slide is to really have a good interview with someone, because one of the things that is most important and really good for fraud examiners, especially, is to try to have, like we do with controls, is to stop it at the beginning. And so being able to have a really good interview and talking to them from either HR or whatever department that is, and talking about the culture within an organization seems very cost effective, but it's just a matter of having that conversation about what's expected before someone comes in, and hopefully reducing that as we move on. As we look at this, the next slide there in terms of employment history, you've got sort of a sweet spot there when we start looking at those who have been there a while. For those who are employees, obviously they make up the biggest number of cases, because they're on that front line. There's many more of them as there are management and moving up to the executive level. But we've got good controls in place, but you can see where when you start correlating that owner executive line to what they have the ability to do, which is what? Override certain controls that are in place. And the ability to go in and check, the ability to go in and look at some of the factors that we're about to see in the next slide, it was really, really important in order to try to knock that amount down. When you look at the next slide, dealing with the level of authority, it does take longer, because we want to make sure that we've got those controls in place. And if someone's able to go in and override it, then you can see from the median side, it starts to rise up for those who have the ability to manipulate. Let's go to the next slide. As well, we deal with gender. Males, depending on the region, are going to be more than females. That data we've seen for a number of years in order to really get a good idea of what we need in terms of infographics, and what you need to do in terms of looking for fraud perpetrators, looking at some of the items that we're going to see in the next couple of slides with those characteristics. And so we will look at the history of someone and the gender. But if you look at the next slide, really telling when we start, what about the number of perpetrators? So if it's one case, that's half of them. And that's really what we focus on a lot. But we also have to look at the median value of that one. And also remember that if there's collusion involved, they have the ability to override a lot of different controls. And so we want to make sure that we are cognizant of that, and we're able to put those controls in place as well for those individuals. Let's look at the next slide there, Ian, in dealing with convictions. And I had mentioned there earlier, it's figure 39 in that next slide.
Just before we go that, why do you think male are doing more fraud than female? One of my friends told me maybe females, they are really doing more fraud than male, but they are so smart, we can uncover them.
Well, I think it's going to depend on the region, and if you look at some of the slides, for them to dive into, a male versus a female in those particular roles that relates to it. I'll say this: it has been fairly consistent with those stats over the years, though.
What's interesting is not only the number of cases, the amount even. For male, they are stealing approximately double the amount than female.
I think you just look at the role, because if you've got a male that's an executive versus a female that is in a lower capacity, when you start really looking at those data and comparing those two sources, The males end up being much, much higher. They're in those positions where they can abuse that authority more. And those of the 2,500 reported cases, the vast majority were male because of that.
All right, perfect. Okay, thank you.
No, good. And again, I mentioned about this, about having that fraud conviction in the past. We've seen that as roughly the same. And so we have to really focus on, I just want to give you this as a data point, but we have to really focus on the thinking of that, the fraudsters that are coming in, they're not going to be out there. And if we don't do something, we don't make it public, if we don't make it known, all they're going to do is move on to the next one. So if we terminate them, then they're going to go to the next organization and try to defraud them as well. Let's go to the next slide. I know we're getting close on time, so I want to make sure that we're able to cover everything and then take a couple more questions. I know we have throughout, but if we needed to add, these are very, very important. When we look at figure 41, how often do perpetrators exhibit these behavioral red flags? And you look, this question has been around for a number of years, but we really started focusing on asking them about 10, 15 years ago, asking CFEs, what did you see before that fraud took place, or rather before it was discovered? And so when we look at it, you're thinking, all right, well, does this mean that I need to go in and look at the parking lot to see if someone is driving a Maserati and things like that? No, but what you're wanting to do is saying, all right, that's interesting. Maybe I should spend a little bit more time on this. Because when you start looking at these behavioral red flags, what we're able to do is from, especially now when we're looking at data from the emotional intelligence, from looking at behavioral analytics and sentiment analysis and things like that, we're able to use this and really dive into those deep data sets in order to see if some of these are there as it relates to that individual's job function. And I've seen some comments going back and forth, really good in making some analysis between quarters, between years of the data that we have available. But then looking at it with some type of sentiment analysis and being able to see some of these. Because, I mean, I'll tell you, in those first 5 or 6 there especially, pretty consistent across the board with the 2,500 plus cases that were part of this. The great infographic on that within the download. I highly recommend you going and seeing that. Let's look at the next slide there, Ian.
I completely agree with you. In the Middle East, we have a recent case, a big case for around 14 million that they discovered just because the employee was driving an expensive car every day to the organization. And he's coming with different cars. Then one person wondered how this employee, who his salary is only 17,000 dirham, can afford this expensive car. And this what triggered auditors to go to his department to do an audit. And then they discovered that actually he's doing massive fraud for 14 million dirham.
Wow. It's there. I mean, you go in fact, I was looking at something as we move to the next slide. Same thing, it was a Ponzi scheme here in the United States. I saw late this last week. The same thing, it was I forget how many millions of what, but he was supporting his country club membership and a lot of the things that we see in those behavioral red flags. So it's there, the data hopefully would support it. So dive into it, use that as you start to plan your audit function, do your investigations. And I think that at least overall, I wanted to end with, why do organizations decline to refer cases to law enforcement? Because we've seen this dip. And if you go back a number of years, for those of you who really want to dive into the data, go back to the mid-2000s, you'll see that has dropped off more than 10%. And it's really, really important that we step back and we look at it, because they're moving from the fear of bad publicity to internal discipline being sufficient. Well, I mean, we need to make sure that this individual is not moving on to company the next one. And so what can we do as an organization and having when I was a public prosecutor in the United States, I had good relationships with, especially with the larger organizations, so that they felt comfortable referring things to me, and having that relationship with not just on the criminal side, but civil regulators as well. And so as an anti-fraud community, well, we need to be thinking about this, because that has gone up significantly, or down rather, significantly on the ones that are referred to law enforcement. I think the remaining slides that relate to within the Middle East and the North African region. And for those of you who want to use that and go in, we will be doing a special report at some point in the coming months, relating and really pulling that information out a little bit more. We tend to do those after we've looked at it globally. You've got the supporting data in there, but we'll extrapolate that in the coming months as well.
But it's interesting to see in the Middle East, related to the issues of taking cases further, that exactly like what the survey said, in the Middle East, most of the organization, they focus on private settlement. They say, just find a way for us to get our money back, to get our assets back, and we don't care about if the person will run away or if we don't take any legal action against the person. So number one priority in so many of the organization is how can we recover our assets?
It's funny you say that. There is a, it was in the hospitality industry, and someone I was talking to was that when this fraud examiner was talking to it, this individual that's stealing, was in the hotel industry, and stealing from this particular unit. And they asked her, well, why you did it? And her reason was, well, I did it at the last one, and I got away with it, and they didn't do anything. So it just almost like it was commonplace. And so we have to be more of a concerted effort to do something about it, rather than just avoiding that publicity. That person will move on, and they are very likely to do that and go into another organization and do the same. I've seen it happen. I've prosecuted people like that in years past. So again, these are data points here. If you want to go through, what are some of the most common occupational fraud schemes in the Middle East and North Africa? Over 50% dealing with corruption. And this is a good, as we move into the next slide, this is good for you to go and look and compare to the global data. And so you can see pretty consistent TIP, internal audit management review, in terms of what we see on how they're detected. We can move into the next slide if you want to. What the controls are in place. The Middle East, North Africa also has using the same types of controls that you're seeing throughout the world. So it's some things are common across the world as we move into the next slide. Others, it may be a little bit different. You can see the same correlation here between the loss in US dollars and the time period in the next slide as it relates. And then you can see the breakdown of the cases and where they came from, in thinking about that within your country, within your region, and hopefully it's it can be helpful to you. And I saw a question that had popped across the bottom. We will be releasing more data from this. There's more than these that's in the slide if you go and look at the report to the nations on the ACFE.com website.
Thank you so much for this depth analysis for the report to the nation. Of course, I went over the report. You need, to spend some couple of hours for you to go over all the details and to really read exactly, what are the important findings in this report. And here we have some questions from our delegates. We have a couple of questions. The first one, what do you think about the effectiveness of the whistleblowing program? Which one do you think is more effective? The one that they are establishing in-house, or they are outsourcing to third party?
I haven't really stratified that data like that. It's a very good question. I think it really is going to depend on that individual, because if ones that are in-house, if they are comfortable with it, and I think we were talking about, and I saw a couple of comments on that tone at the top. You know, if an organization, they feel comfortable with them, then they're going to be more likely to use those in-house. But, you know, a lot of, especially in the smaller organization, I know that they're somewhat reluctant. And so there are different groups out there that you can go in and use. You know, it's sanitized, and they're able to go in and get that information without fear of retaliation because of the size of the unit. But that's a very, very good question. The key is to have some outlet to it for them to talk. And that's what, as you can see here, 50% of these coming through whistleblower in those hotlines.
All right, we have another question. They say, based on your experience over the years, what are the most effective method for identifying fraud that organization they use to identify fraud?
Can you repeat that again, Ian? I'm sorry.
Based on your experience, what are the most common methods that organization use to identify fraud, other than tips or internal, without like what they use, what kind of red flags they use or method to identify that fraud is happening in certain departments?
Well, I think that the best way now, because you go back historically, I mean, it changes. And we've seen that with the data over the last 10 years and how it's moved to more of an electronic society. And so what we have seen over the last few years, especially, and go to that acfe.com/tech report, and you can look at this more. When you look at data analytics, proactive data analytics and monitoring is what the outside of the tip and those types of controls is the best way to, but not only discover that fraud, but reduce that time. So the quicker you are in making those analyses and in discovering, you know, when you see an anomaly, and then you go in and start to go after that a little bit further. Data analytics is the key. It is critical in order to really get that median time frame down.
Yes, I completely agree with you. The interesting thing that today they say we need to manage fraud at the speed of risk. We need to have, you know, these, fraud risk indicators embedded inside the operation of the organization. So we'll be able to actually uncover fraud when it's about to happen. So we need to be able to predict fraud before even happening.
Yes, and that's what sentiment analysis. That's what you know. Having those types of data analytics, and it's really, really an important part of a good holistic fraud risk management plan.
All right, we have our final question. They are looking at the number of cases, and they are saying these are the number of cases different than what they can see in other reports. So can you explain to them why these cases, they are not the actual cases reported by the government or by the organizations?
Well, now these cases are the ones that are reported directly from CFE. There may have actually been more, but for whatever reason, the data was incomplete and something like that. So these are the ones that were reported that were able to be used and making sure that it's in comparison. So when I mentioned very early in the thing about, you know, having those note cards and things like that, being able to make sure that that data is able to be compared to another region or whatever. So that's really the basis of it. But you know, when you look at, regardless of the number of cases from there, and you compare, you've got a lot of the same issues there. You know, we're dealing with corruption as one of the highest things within the Middle East and North Africa. That's the same thing when you look at that data stratified around the world. And so, you know, we are in step around the world dealing with those issues. This is able to give us an idea of what's happening specifically within the region. But by and large, you know, it's a problem. And by having this report sheds a little bit more light on it, and hopefully helps those in a region to really understand it better.
Thank you very much for your thoughts and for your analysis over the report. Definitely, we have like hundreds of questions, but we will not have the time to answer them all. But I would like to give the last minute for you to invite our ACFE members globally to join the event. So if you would like to invite them.
Oh, absolutely. We've the Global Fraud Conference, unfortunately, is not going to be in person, but we will be online. Hopefully you can make it. The 22nd of June, 23rd, 24th. We have over 90 different sessions that will be part of it. Iyad is going to be contributing to our conference as well. There's a lot of takeaways from it. I hope that you can be a part of it. There'll be a way to network within the virtual platform that we're using. We had to pivot very, very quickly. We wanted to hold it in Boston this year. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, we just thought it was best to go ahead and move into a virtual format, and looking really, really forward to it. I'm excited. It's going to be a fantastic event.
I'm sure of it. I can see here the comments from most of the attendees. They say, you know, they were really enjoying the webinar and they are really benefiting a lot. And definitely, you know, by them staying home and staying safe and attending the ACFE conference, I believe this is going to be even more a bigger global conference, because so many ACFE members, they don't have the chance or the budget to fly all over to US. So in that way, they will have the opportunity for them to join thousands of anti-fraud professionals in one place over the internet and learn.
Well, and to add to that, and for more member contribution, I mean, we just got through the report to the nations, and so many of the CFEs were able to contribute and be a part of that, and we certainly appreciate that. There's another survey coming out, and there will be more throughout the year. And so be looking for those if you are a member of ACFE, because what we're trying to find out is how COVID-19 is impacting you. Are you seeing more fraud, less fraud? You know, what's happening in your region? And so we've got a lot of data already. I think that the first survey is going to be cut off at the latter part of this week. I think the 8th of May is the cutoff date of the 9th. So if you can participate, it's a short 6 or 7 questions. It only takes a few minutes, but if you're able to participate that way, we can see what's happening. We can find out what we need to do in terms of education, awareness, and the like. So, you know, we appreciate you being a part of that.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you for being our special guest for this special premium event related to the report to the nations. I would like to thank all the ACFE chapters who supported us, and I would like to thank you all for joining this session. This is the end of our formal session.